The Lord of the Rings: The Battle for Middle-earth is a real-time strategy game developed by EA and released in December of 2004, which was just 1 year after the release of The Return of the King, when the massive craze for the film trilogy was still at its peak. And its primary marketing appeal was the ability to play out large-scale battles like the iconic ones seen in the movies. There's plenty of spectacle, epic clashes of armies, and familiar characters, creatures, locations, and events as you command the forces of good and evil through 2 lengthy campaigns where you can attempt to conquer all of Middle-earth, or play in skirmish and multiplayer modes. The Battle for Middle-earth and later its sequel were, and still are, easily the most popular and successful Lord of the Rings strategy games, but they weren't the first. Much older titles like 1988's War in Middle-earth and 1991's Riders of Rohan were the earliest attempts to turn Middle-earth into a strategic battlefield. And just 1 year before the Battle for Middle-earth's release, Vivendi Games and Liquid Entertainment released an RTS called The War of the Ring. A glaring difference between these two games is that due to licensing agreements, Vivendi could only produce games based on the Lord of the Rings books, while EA could only produce games based on the movies. This would go on to change for the sequel, which was allowed to incorporate lore from the book series. The Battle for Middle-earth's development holds a status of significant notoriety due to details that emerged exposing EA as what could be considered a real-life Sauron. A once famous 2004 blog post by a then anonymous author known only as EA Spouse detailed and strongly criticized EA's labor practices in regards to the project. The post explains how the development team, which included the author's husband, was required to work excessively long hours during a prolonged crunch period, which they were misled into thinking wouldn't be long-lasting. At one point, they worked 13 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no overtime pay, and if they were lucky, they got Saturday evenings off for good behavior. Essentially, EA was willing to try and turn their employees into Gollum in order to get the game out. The blog post went viral and was credited for exposing the use of crunch time in the industry to a broader audience. The bad press pressured EA into making changes, and the entire ordeal resulted in multiple lawsuits against EA, which EA settled for tens of millions of dollars. Anyway, despite all this, the development team managed to pull through and actually release a successful game, even though there was some strong competition from contemporary strategy games like Rome Total War and Dawn of War, which both released just a few months prior. The Battle for Middle-earth was well received by critics, it sold well, and it was nominated for, and in a few cases won, Strategy Game of the Year awards from various publications. Unfortunately, EA's license to produce Lord of the Rings games eventually expired, and with it, so did their ability to continue selling the Battle for Middle-earth, leaving it lost in a licensing limbo with Warner Bros. If you already own a copy or manage to acquire one in other ways, then the experience can be greatly enhanced today thanks to the hard work of fans who have released unofficial patches which help modernize the game, with improvements like enhanced visuals, widescreen support, better camera control, bug fixes, and some versions tweak and seek to improve gameplay, although I'll be focusing on vanilla gameplay in this video. During the 2 campaigns, Middle-earth is represented by an animated and visually appealing 3D world map. Important landmarks like the Tower of Isengard, Minas Tirith, and Mount Doom are easy to spot and accompanied by some nice graphical touches, like this tall plume of smoke billowing out of Mount Doom, and Nazgul and great eagles soaring above various regions. And no, the eagles still don't fly Frodo to Mordor. Armies and groups of important characters position themselves on the map depending on where you are in relation to the story, and hovering your cursor over them sometimes plays a brief montage of relevant scenes from the movies in your UI, which I won't show here for copyright reasons. The designers incorporated the clever idea of using what appears to be glass palantirs as the central feature on a rather simple and unobtrusive UI. You know, the thing that made Pippin make this face. Clearly a lot of focus went into creating a rich presentation, not just during the actual gameplay, but also the elements surrounding and outside of it, which is also evident in the clean and polished menus and loading screens. One of my favorite features is during the loading screens before starting a mission, where you're given some brief lore about the region, narrated by either Ian McKellen as Gandalf or Christopher Lee as Saruman, depending on whether you're playing as good or evil.
Northern Ithilien is a dense wooded land of Gondor, now ruled by Sauron. A valiant few still patrol this region, hoping to one day reclaim it for Gondor.
Caer Andros, a strategic island fortress once used by Gondor to secure the nearby fords of the Anduin.
Other voice actors reprise their roles too, along with a couple very believable imitations. Familiar tracks from Howard Shore's soundtrack for the movie play throughout the game, but there's also an original soundtrack accompanying it. I use the term original a little lightly here because it's so clearly influenced by Howard Shore that at times they sound almost identical. Needless to say, it does a great job of blending with the original music. The cutscenes that play before and after important missions don't look too bad until you see close-ups of characters and realize that they appear much like they do during gameplay, which can look amusing is the kindest word I can think of here. However, the cutscenes rarely last more than 20 seconds, aren't relied upon heavily for storytelling, and are really just there to build up excitement before and after missions. The game's 3D maps have some variety, using several different types of terrain and occurring at either day or night. Although during some parts of the campaign there are clusters of missions in a specific region where most of the maps look quite similar and can feel repetitive, like when you're fighting your way through Rohan. There's also a pretty noticeable difference in visual quality for maps that are used for important story missions, and some of those that are used for filler and optional missions. Minas Tirith, Isengard, Lothlorien, and other major locations look fantastic, and really nail the style and aesthetic used in the films, but they also have the effect of making the blander maps appear that much less remarkable. This does make sense though, since the plains of Rohan and the scorched desert regions surrounding Mordor should appear at least somewhat barren or lifeless, but I still wish they could have found ways to make them appear a little more scenic. Perhaps by adding more areas of elevation to closer resemble the landscapes in the movies, or add more weather effects, which are only used very sparingly. Regardless, none of the maps look or feel too out of place in regards to how Middle-earth was represented in the films, and that was really the most important thing here. Plus, some of the maps that are used for skirmishes or more trivial campaign missions do still look really good, specifically those set in Gondor, where you see the white and weathered Byzantine-style architecture that the region is known for. Even more recognizable than the maps are the units, and pretty much every major Lord of the Rings creature or soldier type has representation here. Uruk-hai, Ents, Trolls, Rohirrim, Nazgul, Elves, Mumakil, and plenty more. They all closely mirror their depictions in the films and can fill out your armies with a broad range of troops. That crazy tentacle monster doesn't get added until the sequel, but hey, nothing's perfect. Even the siege weapons look like they were plucked right out of the movies, and many of the audio effects sound essentially like they were copy and pasted from battle scenes. There are also some nice cinematic touches, like the way your armies cheer after a victory, or cower in fear when confronted by an intimidating foe. And there are some satisfying physics effects, like troops getting launched by a toppled elephant, or tossed to their death by attacking eagles. But what about the main thing that most Lord of the Rings fans were salivating about when the Battle for Middle-earth was first announced? The spectacle of massive, epic battles pitting the forces of good against vast hordes of orcs and Uruk-hai. Well, the game couldn't match the ambitious scope of what CGI was able to produce for the films, but battles can nonetheless still reach an impressive scale, especially during some of the scripted campaign missions, where your armies can greatly exceed the population cap. The inability to zoom out very far with the camera was a limiting factor in how well you could enjoy the spectacle of some of these battles, but thankfully the fan patches removed this restriction. And what the battles concede in total size, they at least partially make up for by allowing you to create scenarios even cooler than what's in the movies, like attacking Minas Tirith with a Balrog, sending Ents and the Army of the Dead to the Black Gate, and using hordes of trolls to sadistically club soldiers. The Great Eagles won't take Frodo to Mordor, but you can watch them go toe-to-toe with Nazgul. And while scenarios like this and other events during the campaign don't strictly stick to the plot as depicted in the films, the visual and sound design is so faithful that the game always distinctly feels like The Lord of the Rings. Having a license to pull art and audio from such beloved, memorable, and visually striking films was an absolute recipe for success, and the Battle for Middle-earth converted it into an RTS in a way that, from a presentation standpoint, I don't really think could have been done much better. The Battle for Middle-earth wasn't designed to be the deepest or most complex RTS, instead putting a heavier focus on its presentation and the moment-to-moment action, but its strategic elements are still the foundation of the overall experience. Economies rely on a single universal resource called resource. The two good factions, Rohan and Gondor, mainly build farms to collect resources.
The farm is ready!
And the evil factions, Isengard and Mordor, have a few options but mainly use the lumber mills. Gondor somehow using food to create stone buildings, and recruiting orcs and evil creatures with mostly wood requires a stretch of the imagination, but it does offer the advantage of not having to worry about gathering and keeping track of stone and gold and copper and coal and iron, and you get the point. These resource buildings and all other structures can only be constructed on build plots placed at fixed locations around the map. Bases expand out from a single build plot and then give you numerous spots for buildings or defensive structures. Same thing for smaller 3-plot outposts. At the cost of some player freedom, this heightens the action by encouraging you to be proactive about map control and venture out to seize build plots to strengthen your economy or expand your territory. Being restricted to these plots does feel limiting, and normally I'd prefer the ability to just build wherever I want, but it does work well to create a steady flow of engagements, since you have to constantly seek out, take over, or defend specific areas that can be very spread out across the map. And as someone who usually ends up creating disgustingly disorganized bases in other RTS games, I was able to appreciate how neat and orderly my bases always turned out here. Castle bases for Gondor and Rohan have the advantage of being surrounded by impenetrable walls, and one feature that I absolutely love is the ability to station archers on top of them. Adding a few towers or trebuchets alongside them can make defending assaults on your base look pretty cool. Unit types are mostly pretty standard, with Rohan and Gondor mainly using archers, cavalry, and foot soldiers. Isengard has pikemen to help deal with pesky Rohan cavalry, and Mordor deviates from the rest by offering not just the ugliest, but also some of the most interesting choices like trolls and elephants. Archers tend to be the most unbalanced, especially in large numbers with fire arrows, because having a weakness doesn't matter if enemies get mowed down before they can even reach you. Using cavalry can be incredibly satisfying because if they do reach their targets, they turn into bulldozers and can just plow through enemies, as long as there are no pikemen around. With the exception of siege weapons and larger units, your forces are grouped together in squads of 5 for good factions and 10 for evil factions. But you can increase this with an interesting mechanic that lets you combine certain squads together. It's a very convenient way to position melee units in front of archers to guard them, but a caveat is that once they're combined, it can't be undone, so you won't be able to use those melee units to charge into battle. It's still a nice option to have though, and it adds another layer to how you can customize your armies. But even more important than the makeup of your army is the veterancy of your units, where your soldiers gain experience and level up by killing opponents. Veterancy has a tremendous impact on how matches and missions play by emphasizing keeping your units alive rather than just using big disposable armies in the hopes of overwhelming your opponent. One exception to this is when playing as Mordor, which I'll discuss more later on. During the campaigns, your armies directly carry over from mission to mission. Ensuring you have a high-level army by the late game is vital for overcoming some of the tougher missions. In your quest to protect and level up your armies, you'll likely find yourself engaging in strategies like tactical retreats, and maybe even intentionally prolonging missions for a while to farm experience. The progression you earn helps form an attachment to your units, and you can even name squads to give them a personal touch. This can make losing one of your high-level squads feel far more devastating than it would units you just churned out and threw straight to the wolves. If you remember that scene in the movie after Gandalf falls in Moria where Frodo screams no for like 10 seconds, that's how I feel whenever I lose a high-level squad. But you don't have to worry too much because high-level units with all the traditional upgrades like increased armor and damage do a great job of holding their own, even when greatly outnumbered by lower-level opponents, which makes the effort you spend protecting and leveling them generally feel worthwhile. A step up on the food chain are the hero units, and if you know anything at all about Lord of the Rings, then you know exactly who's available. They too gain experience, and as they level, you gradually unlock hero powers, which add significant advantages like passive buffs for nearby troops, experience bonuses, and powerful attacks, which in some cases are so devastating they can single-handedly turn the tides of a battle. Few things in the game are more gratifying than using some of these powers, like Gandalf's cataclysmic level 10 power, which wipes out entire armies, or watching Legolas turn into a machine gun. And while heroes aren't invincible, you can revive them for a cost that correlates with how strong they are. As impactful as hero powers are, other special powers at your disposal can influence outcomes even more. Even Star and One Ring powers, which are accessed from this sidebar, provide the most useful and spectacular abilities. Summoning imposing forces like Ents, Eagles, Balrogs, and the Army of the Dead, and then watching them reap havoc significantly heightens the coolness factor of any battle. It takes time to unlock these, especially when you're playing through the campaigns, and all active powers have pretty lengthy cooldowns, so there is strategy involved with knowing when to use them. But you'd definitely be missing out if you don't occasionally bombard an enemy's base with a whole bunch of them just to revel in all the chaos. The Battle for Middle-earth's 2 campaigns are quite long. The Good campaign has 20 required missions and Evil has 18. But if you add in the optional missions where you can take over various regions of Middle-earth, then there are 37 missions on each side for a total of 74. Even fans who sit through 12-hour extended edition marathons will admit that's a lot to get through. The Good campaign starts in the mines of Moria. The developers probably could have squeezed in a few missions of hobbits escaping Nazgul in the Shire, or Aragorn fighting on Weathertop, but starting in Moria is a clear indication that the focus is only on major conflicts, and even some of the conflicts turned into missions that are a bit smaller were embellished to make them larger. Like how during Sam's journey through Shelob's lair, he recruits an army of Gondor soldiers and then leads an assault on Mordor forces. The Good campaign does generally follow the course of events from the Lord of the Rings plot, but there are other significant changes to how things unfold. Gandalf kills the Balrog in Moria and then continues with the Fellowship to Lothlorien. You can save Boromir, and of course nearly everything unravels differently in the Evil campaign. I never minded these changes much, although it would have been nice to have more agency with how some of the character-related conflicts play out. Like if the Balrog defeats Gandalf, then maybe you lose him for a few missions until he revives later on. During the Evil campaign, you kill Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli during a relatively early mission, but then they still show up later with the Army of the Dead during the Siege of Gondor. Shouldn't the reward for killing them be that Mordor's reinforcements arrive instead? Or maybe make them ghosts too. That would have been pretty interesting. There is one reactive moment that I thought was really well done though, where after defeating King Theoden at Helm's Deep during the Evil campaign, Éowyn leads Rohan's armies at Minas Tirith, and even gives the exact same speech that Theoden does in the movies. More moments like this could have tied together some of these story changes better, and added a bit more weight to your actions. My criticisms of the campaign mostly end here though, because the way you progress across Middle-earth and the missions themselves are an incredibly good time. As you complete missions, you're granted 1 or 2 of 3 available bonuses. Points you can use to purchase Even Star or One Ring powers, a resource multiplier, and command points which raise the maximum size of your armies. These rewards, along with the progression from raising the veterancy of your armies, gives you a genuine feeling of growing stronger as you move towards the most pivotal battles. The first half of the Good campaign consists of a mixture of story missions following the Fellowship, and separate missions where you control Éomer and the Rohirrim as they battle against the forces of Isengard, with both paths eventually merging at the Battle of Helm's Deep. Here, you're given a moment of glory when many of the exact same troops and heroes you trained in prior missions join forces to take out Isengard's massive army. But even with a well-trained army, this mission is, as you would expect it to be, lengthy and quite challenging, even on medium difficulty. And the way it replicates some of the battle scenes from the movie is impressively spot on. After Helm's Deep, the focus shifts to Gondor, whose armies have stronger defensive capabilities, which is a nice change of pace from the more offensive-orientated Rohan armies. Missions grow more and more intense as you're now forced to deal with Mordor's armies, and formidable units like Nazgul, Mumakil, and Mordor's siege weapons. The missions here culminate in the two enormous battles at Minas Tirith and the Black Gate. Fending off the torrential onslaught of orcs during the Battle of Minas Tirith isn't quite as challenging as the Helm's Deep mission, but it is more satisfying because you have much stronger defensive weapons at your disposal. It closely follows the story beats and concludes with Rohan's army and the Army of the Dead showing up to save the day. And you can even use the ghost to swarm the elephants just like in the movie. There's no Legolas skateboarding on top of one, but that was for the better. The final mission at the Black Gate can be brutal, but beforehand you're given a chance to travel around Middle-earth and finish up optional missions to help level up your army and unlock the strongest powers. When you're ready, you're put up against a perpetual flow of Mordor troops and have to just stay alive until a timer counts down to indicate that Frodo reached Mount Doom. It's tough and epic and offers a refreshing sense of finality, where you can ditch the worry about keeping your army alive for the next mission and just brawl with the worst Mordor has to offer. The Evil campaign starts with you commanding Saruman and his armies. The story missions here do an excellent job of flipping the script and providing entertaining scenarios where you get to unleash havoc with hordes of evil creatures. You'll murder hobbits, set fire to Ents, storm the capital of Rohan, and bury King Theoden by swarming Helm's Deep. Isengard doesn't have nearly as many hero units as good factions do, but they make up for this to some degree with their strong and versatile siege weapons. And the Uruk-hai troops are so formidable and mean that you can literally make them fight each other to farm extra experience. A major difference between good and evil factions is that the maximum unit cap for evil armies is twice as large, which fits well with the narrative since the forces of good are supposed to be in the most peril. The Evil campaign starts to get really interesting at about the midpoint when you're given command of Mordor's armies. If you play the good campaign first, which I expect most people do, then up until now the three factions you've used have had their differences, but none so drastic as what it's like using Mordor. And for a campaign as long as this one, it's refreshing to have a change of playstyle offered for the final hurdle. Mordor hero units like Nazgul and Shelob are only available for a mission or two. And instead, you get to use the big regular units like elephants and trolls, who are just hilariously good fun to pound through opposing armies with. But it's really the smaller troops like orcs that make playing as Mordor feel so different. Mordor can produce standard orc units for free, which lets you just queue up endless hordes to throw at your opponent. Evil factions also have unique powers that help you gather more resources, increase unit production speed, and there are ways you can lower the cost of stronger units. So when everything's clicking, you can produce large armies very quickly. I've played some highly entertaining missions where I just constantly bombard opponents with massive lower level armies of orcs to wear them down, and then send in the stronger units to finish the job. And this seems like an appropriate playstyle since sending hundreds of orcs to their doom in order to win is just how Sauron would act. One question I've asked myself is, would the Battle for Middle-earth be an enjoyable RTS if it had nothing to do with The Lord of the Rings? That's hard to envision because of how deeply intertwined it is with the rest of the experience, but I do think its gameplay mechanics could probably hold up well enough to make for a fun game. The heavy focus on veterancy and gradually unlocking powers gives an excellent sense of progression, and while it is more accessible than some other RTS games, it's not overly simplistic, at least not for me. With that being said, there's no doubt that the Battle for Middle-earth's real crowning achievement is how well it captures the essence of battles from the film trilogy, with a style, atmosphere, and polish that I think any fan of the franchise would acknowledge as being great. Not surprisingly, it was followed by a popular sequel, which then in turn got a big expansion. Unfortunately though, they've suffered the same fate and are no longer available for purchase either. And all of the official online servers shut down ages ago. But on the bright side, a passionate community emerged around the series, reviving online play and releasing tremendous updates like major patches revamping gameplay and huge mods offering lots of new content, making now a better time than any to experience these games.